talk about this material. To me, it's really, really critical. Of course, everybody who comes up with something thinks it's really critical, but I really feel like at this point in education in the Western world, our failure to understand what it means to interact with other people is keeping us from leading the kind of change that our kids really need. And it's not to say that good things aren't already happening, or it's not to criticize the, in fact, just the opposite. It's not to criticize the professionalism of teachers. In fact, it's to say we need to treat teachers like professionals if we want professional growth. Today's talk isn't about what we do, it's about the beliefs behind what we do. And I'm going to just make a statement that if we know a lot, but we come from the wrong place, so to speak, we're going to have a hard time making change. In fact, it'll be hard for people to hear us if we come from a place, if we position them as people who are going to resist. And I work with people around the world. I've had the good fortune of working with people from every continent. Either they've come to Kansas and work with me here, or I've come to their location. And I would say of all the things I talk about, the thing that people respond to most positively are the partnership principles. So I'm excited to talk about them. It's a lot of information, though. I've got these guiding questions. I want to talk about where the ideas came from for the partnership approach. I want to talk about the research that was conducted. I want to talk about what is a principle, what are the partnership principles, and what do we mean by responsible and irresponsible accountability, which are two terms I'm kind of introducing right now. And the other thing is the difference between a culture of talk and a culture of action. And the last two questions are really shaped by the first part of what we talked about, what these principles are. It's a lot of information, and I thought about this Bob Dylan song where he says, I need a dump truck mama to unload my head, and that's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm just going to unload all these ideas, but I do want to give people resources so if they can go back and look for more, and I've got links and different bits of information to kind of lay it all out. But first off, where did these principles come from? I thought it would be useful to just tell the story of how stuff started. And how stuff started really was with this book, Paulo Freire's book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I read this in university, like many people. My second year, I took a philosophy of education course, and I was just struck by how Freire taught me that the way we interact can be mutually humanizing or it can be dehumanizing. And Freire's book shaped me to recognize that not taking a dialogical approach, what he calls banking communication or banking education, if we see communication as top-down, we're actually adopting something you'd have to call dehumanizing. Freire puts it this way. He says, apart from inquiry, apart from the praxis, people cannot be truly human. Knowledge emerges through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry people pursue in the world, and with each other. And when we don't give people the chance to do that kind of thinking, he would say it's dehumanizing. Another big book early on in my career, when I was a graduate student, now I read Bernstein's book called Beyond Objectivism and Relativism, Science, Hermeneutics, and Practice. It's not a light read. I wouldn't take it to the beach, but it was a book that really shaped my thinking, because what Bernstein showed me was that dialogue is a way to transcend worldviews. It's a way for, through dialogue, we can come to a meeting and an understanding. And a quote from Bernstein is, a dialogue or a conversation among individuals must be based on mutual respect, equality, a willingness to listen, and to risk one's prejudices and opinions. Bernstein's book was looking at the philosophy of science and sort of post-Kuhnian philosophy. Then another big book that influenced me, and I stumbled onto it as I started to explore the idea of partnership, with Rian Eisler's book, The Chalice and the Blade. I had the chance to work with Rian for a while. And Rian talks about the idea of partnership in its sort of anthropological and historical sense. She points out that there have been whole societies that were grounded in partnership, and she contrasts a partnership world with a patriarchal world. And of course, it suggests that we should take the partnership approach. And she says, on the social level, this is actually from a different book than the Chalice and the Blade, but it's from one called The Partnership Way. But she says, on the social level, partnership is the alternative to both patriarchy and matriarchy. On the personal level, all interactions have the possibility of partnership, because interaction based on mutual respect and empowerment, which is the essence of the partnership model, can happen with all kinds of people in all kinds of different settings. And then another book that was really influential was Peter Block's book called Stewardship. And Peter is the one who really got me thinking about this concept of partnership and the importance of autonomy and choice, along with the problems that are inherent in a top-down approach. And so Peter got me thinking about this, and this book came out just as I was doing my research on this, and he said this about partnership, amongst many other things. And I got to say, this is a book really worth taking the time to look at. But Block and his other books are outstanding too, but Block says saying no is the fundamental way we have of differentiating ourselves. To take away my right to say no is to claim sovereignty over me. If we can't say no, then saying yes has no meaning. So all these books combined got me thinking about a different way of interacting. I had been doing workshops where I just would basically tell people, you have to do it the way I say or else. And I wanted to try out a different kind of workshop where it was dialogical, where there was a back and forth flow of meaning and where every brain was involved. And so I decided to do a research study on it. And I'm going to give you a really quick study, overview of the research. I'm not going to go into much detail, but I'll give you a link if you want to download the article and do it. So what I did is I tried out two different approaches to conducting a workshop. One, the partnership approach, grounded in the 7 principles we're going to talk about. And one of them was a traditional approach, grounded in the notion of fidelity. You should do it the way I teach it. And the partnership approach gave people lots of opportunity for dialogue and discussion, and the traditional approach was kind of a little bit like this session, just talking for a while and then pause and see if people had questions. And in the traditional approach, I emphasized the importance of fidelity. In the partnership approach, I emphasized the choice of everybody thinking things through on their own. In a counterbalance design like this, is set up so that the group gets both things. So group A had a workshop on visual imagery in the morning and a self-questioning workshop in the afternoon. And group B had the same thing. If you look at the line beside group B, visual imagery in the morning, self-questioning in the afternoon. But I did group A, I did the partnership approach with the early session. And in group B, I did the partnership approach with the later session. And then I compared the results of the 2 partnership learning sessions with the 2 traditional learning sessions. If there was a difference, it wasn't going to be when we had them, because one was before, and one was the first one was the second one. And one of them was visual imagery, and one of them was self-questioning. The only conclusion you can make is that if there's a difference, it's got to be because of the way we approached it, the partnership approach. And I asked a lot of research questions. I wanted to know, did one of them increase knowledge? Did people learn more from one than the other? Were they more likely to implement? Were they more engaged? Did they enjoy themselves more? And I used different kinds of measures. I had a little test for people's knowledge at the end of each workshop. I had a question about implementation. I had people self-assess their engagement. And then there was a workshop evaluation form to get at these kinds of things. Then I compared the partnership approach with the traditional approach, recognizing again that it wasn't when it was offered, it wasn't what the content was, it was the approach that must have made the difference. And the cool thing about counterbalance design is that you're not comparing apples to oranges. You're comparing the same people to each other. So in the morning and in the afternoon, the same people were at the workshop. Well, the results were pretty conclusive. And like I said, I'll give you the link to the paper. But these are the scores people gave on their evaluation form for comprehension. The black scores on a score of 1 to 7, people's self-assessment was almost all 4s, 5s, 6s, and 7s, but you can see the traditional approach, people's self-assessments of their comprehension were not nearly as high as the partnership approach. When we have people self-assess the level of engagement, you can see that, again, the traditional approach was kind of across the board, but a high level of not that much engaged in a workshop that was a lecture kind of based approach. But in the partnership approach, way higher. And then again, on a scale of 1 to 7, for enjoyment, people have more fun, if you want to put it that way, in the workshop that was the one for the partnership away. And then I had people fill in this engagement form during the workshops, and they would circle their level of engagement. And a bell would go off every 10 minutes, and the form went from 1 to 7. I told people 1 was a near-death experience, and 7 was better than chocolate. And I had to rate their level of engagement. And it was pretty conclusive when people filled in their self-assessment forms for engagement in the partnership approach, as you can see on the chart. It was way higher than people did on the traditional approach. I don't have the graph here. It's not actually a graph, but we had statistically significant differences in people's content knowledge too. They learned a lot more in the other session. And their likelihood of implementation, I asked them the question, now that you've learned 2 strategies, which of the 2 do you believe you're most likely to teach? And 59 people chose the partnership approach, and 14 put the traditional approach. So looking this over, you can see that partnership really had a much bigger impact on what happened. Now, if you want to read that paper, you can just go to this website and look it up, and you'll be able to see the session. And if you just want more information on the partnership approach and to watch me do some videos back when I was way younger, and to download this little book, it's about 70 pages long. It's a free book you can use on the partnership approach in workshops. You can go there to that link and you can download it. But first off, maybe what is a principle? So I thought before we actually talk about the actual partnership principles, it would be good to talk about what we mean by a principle. So a few years ago, my wife and I were delighted to find out we were going to have a child. And it's turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to us. We have this sweet boy named Luke. And he's a constant joy. It's absolutely, well, not always, but he's either 90% angel or 10% monster. He's 3 years old, almost 4, so, you know, if you have a 3-year-old, you probably know what I'm talking about. Anyway, when my wife was about 7 months pregnant, and visibly pregnant in a pretty obvious way, she brought home this dress, and she said to me, and it was a black and white stripe, not a dress, but a top. And she put it on, and she said to me, and this is an exact quote, she said, "Does this dress look like a fat zebra? Make me look like a fat zebra." That's an actual quote. So I've asked this question of many men in my workshops, and I say, what is the correct response when your wife asks a question like that? And I said, what if there was a little zebra action going on in your mind just as she asked the question? And most men squirm a little bit when the question is asked. One guy, in fact, raised his hand in one of my workshops, and he said, "Jim, the correct answer is wow, because who knows, is that good or bad? Nobody can really tell." And that day in my workshop, everybody gave me wow. It's on the evaluation form. But the point is that Jenny and I have committed to a principle, and the principle is what we call radical honesty. And the idea of radical honesty is that we tell the truth about everything. In fact, we meet every week, and we sit down, go out for breakfast on Saturday morning, and we sit down and we go through this list of questions. And the rule is, if there's something that I experience, that I do or I think or I say, that I think I'm not sure I want Jenny to hear about that, I have to tell her. And that's a principle we live by, and it guides everything we do. And that principle shapes my thoughts, it shapes my actions, and it shapes what I say. And that's how principles work. They guide us. They help us through things. Now, by the way, I'm not a marriage counselor, so I'm not recommending you necessarily do what we do. Our theory is, though, you should be transparent with the most important person in your life. That you don't want to be living with a stranger. But I don't know that that would work for anybody other than us. But that's how a principle works, though. A principle guides our behavior. If we say we're honest, we live in an honest way. At least a life of integrity is one where our actions reflect our principles. And I believe and argue that if we don't know our principles, if we haven't thought them through and carefully given thought to them, if we're wishy-washy about what we stand for, it's hard for us to accomplish what we want to accomplish. And I think if we stand on the wrong principles, if we got our behavior by the wrong principles, for example, people should do what I tell them as a principle, we might encounter a lot of problems that interfere with what we do. So understanding our principles, I think, is critical to being effective as a leader, as a coach, as a teacher. And we've come up with these 7 principles based on those works that I talked about before. Equality, choice, voice, dialogue, reflection, praxis, and reciprocity. Now I'm going to spend more time on the first few choices than the later ones, because in many ways the first few choices shape everything else, especially the first 3. And I'm not going to argue that you should adopt these choices, but I will tell you that they've shaped the work that we do. But if I was to tell you, you must adopt these choices, I'd kind of be violating the principle of choice. So I'm going to throw them out there and let you think about what you think about them and give some thought to it. But what I would say and what I do believe is it is really important to know what your principles are. And so whether you adopt these principles or some others, and these principles are focused on how we relate to other people. Whether we adopt these ones or some others, I think it's really important to know what our principles are, whether it's these ones or not. The first principle is the principle of equality. And, of course, everybody believes in equality. Nobody's going to say, no, I don't believe in equality. It's there in the Constitution in the U.S. It's in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Equality is a word we use all the time. You know, all people are born equal. But I would say that we have to think carefully about what equality means. Of course, it means that people should have equal access, and it means that people should be treated equally, equal opportunity. But I think equality means something else, and I have a story to kind of illustrate it. Now, in our family, our hero was Wayne Gretzky. I grew up in Canada, so prenatally I was a hockey fan. A little disconcerted by the fact that there are no Canadian teams in the Stanley Cup playoffs this year, but that's another story. At any rate, we were huge hockey fans, and my kids happened to grow up right when Wayne Gretzky was at his prime. And I would argue, statistically, no one has dominated a professional sport the way Gretzky has. You could say that Babe Ruth redefined the game in ways Gretzky didn't, and you could say that maybe Michael Jordan was more of a clutch player, even Rocket Richard in hockey. But in terms of statistical superiority, I'm not sure anybody comes close. When Gretzky was at his prime, he once got more points in a season than anybody, not counting his goals, just his assists, and he had more goals than anybody else. One year he scored 50 goals in 39 games, and the whole season is 82 games. And only, I think, 11 players have ever scored it in 82 games. He scored 50 goals in 39 games. He holds the record for most goals in a season, most goals in a career, most assists in a season, most points in a season, most points in a career, holds the record for most records. His nickname was the Great One. He was so good that when he retired, they retired his number across the NHL, which no one else has ever had that happen to them in hockey. It's happened in baseball for good reasons, but not in hockey. And in our family, Gretzky was the guy. We had a life-size cutout of Gretzky in the basement. And when we go down and watch TV, we'd say, hey, Wayne, how you doing today? And my kids loved Gretzky. They wanted to wear Gretzky's number. They wore their shirt the way Gretzky wore his shirt. If they played hockey in the driveway, it was Gretzky versus Gretzky. When Jeff was only 3 years old, I woke him up so he could watch Gretzky win the first Stanley Cup playoff he ever won, or the first Stanley Cup championship. And so in 2005, my family and I, kids and I, we went up to the World Junior Hockey Championships, and we stayed at this little, pretty humble hotel. We woke up to have breakfast the next day, and we're eating there. It's a pretty, like basically it was waffles and coffee. And who should come through the door? Well, we're having our breakfast. We sit down 10 feet away from us, but Wayne Gretzky. And during our breakfast, and he was there the whole time, and I'm sure he picked our place because he figured nobody would find him. But during the breakfast, there must have been 10 people who came in to talk to him. They came in to get books signed, sweaters signed, get their picture taken. All this before 9, probably before 8:30 in the morning. And so before he left, I couldn't help but say something to Wayne Gretzky, even though he'd been bugged so much. Now, we would have loved the picture. My kids just thought he was awesome. But we couldn't do that, but we just thought that would be too much. But I had to say something, so I said to him, I just have to thank you for all the pleasure we've had watching you play hockey. It's been fantastic to watch you play. Now, here's the guy, the greatest player of all time, the most points, most scores. He must be told 100 times a day how much he meant to them and how good he was. And he stopped before he left, and he turned to me, and he said, and I'm sitting there with my kids. He said, well, thanks for saying that. He said, I just love to play the game. And then he talked to me and my kids for a few minutes, like we were just regular people, friends of his almost, or neighbors or something. And he said, this is going to be a great game. Canada's never had a team like this. It's going to be awesome. And he really took the time to talk to us as if we counted. And I think he did that because he didn't think he was any better than us, because he thought we were equals. In fact, that's the concept of equality. I don't see the other person. I don't see myself as more important than the other person. When Martin Luther King says, I have a dream that everyone will be recognized that all people are created equal, I don't think he's just talking about opportunity, although he certainly is. In fairness, he's also talking about the fact that we see other people as counting the same. It's people who've been really influential in your life in a lot of cases. I bet you can identify somebody who you say, that person treated me like an equal. So that's the principle of equality, and it's there in some books. Edgar Schein's book, Helping, and Schein's a real leader in the whole area of understanding how people interact, and a real pioneer in helping us understand organizational culture and human relationships. And he says that in any relationship where one person is helping another person, like a principal with a teacher with a student, a coach with a teacher, any kind of helping relationship, he said, people resist if they don't get the status they think they deserve. He said if people perceive us as putting ourselves one up and putting them one down, they will resist. Or another way to put it is, he says, if we take the role of being a parent with someone else who's an adult just like us, and we put them in the role of being a child, he says they will resist. In fact, he says they might fight back in childish ways. So the principle about equality is about giving the other person the status they deserve. In fact, the way Daniel Pink puts it, he says we need to put other people in the big chair and we sit in the little chair. One dangerous way in which we don't give people equal status is through judgment. In fact, Michael Fullan, in the 6 Secrets of Change, he says that one of the 6 secrets of change is what he calls non-judgmentalism. If we judge other people, we put ourselves up and we put them down, and we say, I am better than you, essentially. And he says, well, so one way to damage what I would call equality and what Michael would call a secret of change is to avoid judgment. Judgment is a learning killer. No one's going to be learning if they feel judged. They will be quiet. So the first principle then is the principle of equality, is that other people count the same as us. The second principle is the principle of choice. And the principle of choice is simply that if we're equals, then you should have some choices. I was in this classroom in North Carolina, and there was a teacher teaching Spanish. It was a 7th grade class. This is a picture from her classroom. And she was a wonderful teacher, and she had this student, and she said, okay, I need you to get together in groups, and I need you to practice your Spanish. And this one student says, I don't want to sit in a group. And she said, you don't want to sit in a group? He said, no, I don't want to sit in a group. I hate groups. And she said, you don't have to get in a group. Let me give you a choice. What you could do is you could just go to the back of the book, and you can answer all the questions in the back of the book. And that's the same content, and you can practice with your peers, or you can do it on your own. And if you don't have time today, just finish it tonight and show it to me tomorrow. And he said, do I have to do all the questions? She said, well, we will ask all the questions in the group. So yeah, you got to do all the questions, or you can go in the group. It's up to you. He said, I think I'll join the group. And if she'd said, look, get in the group because I told you so, the kid would have resisted. But because she gave him a choice and he felt respected and treated respectfully, he made the choice. There's an old saying that kind of wraps this all up, and it's that saying, when you insist, they will resist. If you take away choice, you're not going to get much enthusiastic embracing of what you're sharing. A great book about this is Edward Dece's work, Why We Do What We Do. And Dece and Ryan, their research is foundational in understanding the importance of giving people choice, or what he would call autonomy. If we don't give people choice, what we're going to get is a lot of resistance. Dece puts it this way. He says, control is an easy answer. It sounds tough, so it feels reassuring to people who believe things have gone awry. However, it's become increasingly clear that the approach simply doesn't work. That is, the top-down approach simply doesn't work. The widespread reliance on rewards and punishments to motivate responsibility has failed to yield results. And then he goes on to say, essentially, that the evidence suggests that so-called solutions based on the principle of rigid authority, telling people what to do, are making things worse rather than making them better. Telling people what to do is not the solution, especially with complex work like teaching. Nice summary of Dece and Ryan's research and other research on motivation is Daniel Pink's book. And Pink puts it this way when he talks about goals. He says goals are important, but they have to be the goals we choose. We're not excited by other people's goals. And he says goals that people set for themselves and that are devoted to attaining mastery are usually healthy. For example, one of my goals is to run the Boston Marathon. That's a healthy goal, even though I probably can't run a 5K right now. It's still a goal that matters to me because I chose it and it matters. The goals that are imposed by others, sales targets, quarterly returns, standardized test scores, and so on, they can have dangerous side effects. If we don't give people a choice, chances are we're not going to get the kind of commitment we want. There's recently a study released, and I'll give you the link, by the U.S. Department of Education that looks at autonomy in schools. And they have a nice summary of why autonomy will keep teachers in the program and increase motivation. And then they talk about how teachers' perceptions of autonomy have changed over the last decade. They look at the results from 2003, 2004, 2007, 2008, 2011, 2012, and they compare the results. And what they found is, I'm sure you won't be surprised, that autonomy is going down. In the first category, 03, 04, about 18% said they had low autonomy. In 11, 12, it was 26%. And the number of people who had high autonomy went from 17 to 12%. Only 12% of teachers in 2011, 2012 in this study, large numbers, said that they had a lot of autonomy, either low or moderate autonomy for 88% of the teachers. You can find that study if you're interested at this website, and you can download the report and see it. But one more thing needs to be said about choice, and that is that too many choices isn't helpful. Barry Schwartz, in The Paradox of Choice, points out that the paradox of choice is that if we have too many choices, it's overwhelming. If we have innovation overload in the school, for example, it's going to be inhibiting, not helping with change. It's better to have a small number of focused choices. If you ever go into a restaurant like Cheesecake Factory, where they give you this monster menu, and a really great server will come over and help you sort through all those choices so you can actually make a choice, because if you're overwhelmed by the choices, it's not going to be helpful. That's the paradox of choice. Schwartz gave a great presentation on TED about this at, he was at Oxford University where he gave the presentation. Another great book on choice is Sheena Iyengar's book, and she talks about this famous study she did, one that actually Barry Schwartz quotes in his book. And she went into this store where they sold something like 300 different jars of jam. This is a little snippet from her TED Talk. That's where I got this picture. And she offered people the chance to sample 6 types of jam or to sample 24 different types of jam. And she wanted to see, is there a difference between how many people buy jam when there are only 6 jars versus 24 jars? And what she found is that the 6 jars of jam sold 6 times as much as the 24 jars of jam. It was dramatically more because people were overwhelmed by all the choices. Now, more people stopped for all the jars, but they were less likely to purchase them. And you can see her TED Talk at this link if you want to go see what she has to say. A final thought about all this stuff about choice is this, that I think that there are some choices that can't be on the table. There are certain non-negotiables, for example, in any situation. In schools, you can't say, we're not going to do reading and writing this year, it's all going to be Pinterest. No, you've got to do reading and writing. But the trouble is, if everything's a non-negotiable, people will resist. Often when I talk about choice, the word accountability comes up. And what people are saying is like, but don't teachers have to be accountable? And so I want to distinguish between what I call responsible and irresponsible accountability. Responsible accountability is accountability where I make a choice. And irresponsible accountability is where I have no choice. Peter Block, in his great book, Freedom and Accountability at Work, he has this quote that we wrote with Peter Kustenbaum, and it said, we have a small way of thinking about accountability, he says. We think that people want to escape from being accountable. We believe that accountability is something that must be imposed. We have to hold people accountable, and we divide reward and punishment schemes to do this. Those beliefs are so dominant in our culture that they are difficult to question, if they're the very beliefs that keep us from experiencing what we long for. And irresponsible accountability is where we tell people what to do and we don't give them a choice, because the second part of that is, after they do what we told them, they say, well, I tried that thing you said and it didn't work. They don't feel personal responsibility. We had a person come to our workshop about a month ago, and she said, well, my principal went to this teacher, and he said to the teacher, your scores aren't going very well, and we need to do some changes. And the teacher looked at the principal and said, look, I'm implementing the program you told me to do, and I'm doing it exactly the way you say. If the scores aren't going up, I don't have any responsibility. If the scores aren't going up, it's not me, it's your program. So responsible accountability is where people have a choice. And one more thing about choice. If people want to call themselves professionals, to join the gang we would call a professional, it's important to recognize that part of being a professional, an always present characteristic of professionalism, is continuous improvement. Professionals keep working at improving what they do. And choosing to say, no, I've got this down, there's no room for improvement, you have to call that unprofessional. Literally, by definition, it's an unprofessional action. So there's a lot wrapped up in choice. Some choices aren't on the table. Other choices, there's wide room. And I think we want accountability, but we also want autonomy. And one without the other doesn't get the job done. Accountability without choice, you're just going to get mediocre compliance. Choice without accountability, it's probably not going to make it happen. And accountability means we're doing something that really makes a difference. So the second principle is the principle of choice. People should have a lot of choices about what they do. Third principle is the principle of voice. I love this little quote by G.K. Chesterton. He says, there's a lot of difference between listening and hearing. And the idea with voice is simply this, that people want to be heard when they do what they do. Marcus Buckingham studied over 1 million surveys and found that one of the critical variables with people who love their work was that at work they could say, I feel like my opinion matters. So this guy, Shane Lopez, decided he wanted to study who feels their voice matters at work. He looked at over 70,000 surveys of people who are in sales and clerical work, construction workers, doctors, nurses, teachers, transportation workers, repair workers. And he and I got together and talked about his research. He lives in Lawrence, where I live, here in Kansas. And when I asked him what he found, he said, Jim, you won't believe who was at the bottom of the list. Below clerical workers, below service workers in restaurants and truck drivers. The lowest on the list, teachers. Lower than anybody else. And so voice is a critical characteristic that people feel like they've been heard, and we need to do that organizationally and in one-to-one conversations. But what we're seeing in schools is not enough, that people feel like their voice matters. You can read that study on my blog. I've got a link to it there. One more thing is that what I'm saying here also applies to students. Russ Qualley, in his book on student voice, found that only 45% of students reported that they felt they were valued members of their school community, that they felt their voice mattered. And the reality is, as Mary Lou Casey says, what people really need is a good listening to. So the third principle, the principle of voice, is that other people's count as much as our voices count. Now, when you put equality, choice, and voice together, the next principle is dialogue. And a lot of people have talked about dialogue. One of the most important and seminal books is this book by Bohm called On Dialogue. It's a short little essay. You can download it pretty cheap as an e-book, and it's really wise and worth looking at. It's only really about 50 pages. They put an introduction in the book to make it feel like a big book, but it's pretty short. But probably the book that influenced me the most is the one we talked about at the start, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And Freire gives us 5 conditions for dialogue. He says a dialogue begins with humility. If we're sure we're right, and we're just trying to force people to buy into our perspective, we're not really going to have much of a dialogue. A dialogue, I want to hear what you have to say. Secondly, a dialogue is grounded in hope. If we've given up, we're not really going to have a dialogue. A dialogue is a conversation about a better future, a conversation where the two of us together, or however many are in the conversation, are talking about making things better. If we've given up, not much is happening dialogically. The third thing is faith. And what he means by that is I believe this person I'm talking to, even if they're a child, even if they're a brand new teacher with very little experience, I believe this person has something to teach me. And so when I talk to them as a learner, open and anxious to hear what they have to say. The fourth thing is critical thinking. It's the idea that we're thinking together, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the last concept is the concept of love. Love seems like a funny word, and it's not a word we often associate with professional development. But what I think he means is that we have the best interest of the other person at heart, and we engage in conversations that he calls mutually humanizing conversations, conversations that help us grow and develop, and not conversations that diminish us, life-affirming conversations. So a dialogue is the belief that all brains should be involved in conversations, not just the brain of the speaker. Inherent in dialogue, as I said, is this idea of critical thinking. And critical thinking is what actually happens during dialogue because the two people are thinking together. And that leads to the next principle, which is reflection. Now, many people have written about reflection. I really love Bill Summers' work on this, but one book I want to mention is this one by Thomas Davenport called Thinking for a Living. Now, Davenport studied people who think for a living, knowledge workers, a term that I think initially came out of Drucker's work. What Davenport did is he did surveys and interviews, and he tried to figure out what are the characteristics of these people who think for a living. And what he found is the defining characteristic of a knowledge worker, a person who thinks for a living, is the need to think. He says personal autonomy is more important than anything else when it comes to a knowledge worker. In fact, he puts it this way: if we do the thinking for other people, we're going to engender resistance. So reflection stands at the heart of dialogue, but it also stands at the heart of what we want to do as knowledge workers. And for me, reflection involves looking back at what happened, looking at what's happening right now, and looking ahead. So a teacher might look back on how the class went and say, what do I need to do differently? A teacher might look at what's happening right now and make some adjustments, or a teacher might say, how can I use this knowledge and put it into the future? And that act of reflection leads us to the sixth principle, which is the principle of praxis. So to introduce the principle of praxis, I want to share a story with you. My wife, Jenny, went to this conference. I actually wanted to go to the conference too, but unfortunately I couldn't go for some family reasons. But she went to this one workshop, and the person gave everybody a tape measure like this one right here. And then he said, okay, the tape measure was a paper one. He said, take the tape measure and count off, and if you look on the back of this one, there's a metric. He said, look at the metric side of the tape measure. He said, count to how old you are and rip off the tape measure at that point. So somebody who is 40 would rip it off at 40. He said, now tape the tape measure. And he says, count ahead to how many years you think you've got left in your life. And so people pulled it out, and they said, I'm going to live to be 85. They ripped it off at 85. And then he said, hold this up. What you've got left. He said, that's your life. That's what you got left. What are you going to do with that part of your life? And that was a pretty profound thing for Jenny. She thought pretty deeply about it. When she came home, it was profound for me. And I got a tape measure out and went down to the clothing store or the sewing store, got a tape measure, cut it out. Now on my bulletin board right behind me, I've got my tape measure of how many years I've got left. And the idea that is behind that for me is that we don't want to waste our time on checking off boxes and having conversations that don't make a difference for kids or don't make a difference for our lives. We want to have conversations that truly do lead to really important and good things. And praxis, this sixth principle, is the idea that we see others as people who count, whose brains are a part of the conversation with us, but also who should be working on things that matter. And when we talk to them, when we engage in praxis, it's not just about thinking, but it's about thinking grounded in action, reflection in action. It's real-life application of our learning on things that matter to us. Now, in schools, we don't always experience praxis. I think there's a distinction in schools between a culture of talk and a culture of action. Bob Sutton says the trouble is we confuse talking about something as being the same as actually doing something. But if we live according to the principle of access, we shift away from a culture of talk to a culture of action. If we have a workshop, it's leading to real change in the school. If we do coaching, there's measurable outcomes that matter to the teacher that will make a difference for kids. And the process is followed through until the goal is hit. We have a school-wide school improvement plan. We don't just chuck something together in the last 6 weeks before the audit, but we engage the whole school in a process of change. And that kind of experience, working on it, talking about it, doing things that matter, that's the principle of praxis. So for me, praxis is to say that learning is most powerful when it's a part of work that we really consider really important. The last principle is the principle of reciprocity. And it's a simple kind of summation of all this. Reciprocity is the old notion that when one teaches, two learn. Reciprocity is the belief that we should encounter others as learners and teachers. And so a simple way to put reciprocity is we should learn as much or more than we teach. And I hear that all the time with coaches. They say, I really kind of want to go back to the job of teaching because I'm learning so much as a coach. I know I'm supposed to be helping them learn, but they are teaching me so much, these people I work with. So that's the seventh principle. Now again, the idea of a principle is the notion that it guides our behavior. And whether you choose these ones or some other ones, I think it's important to think things through. But I would say that in each case, there's that argument to be made that without people feeling like they're equal, they're likely going to resist. How do you feel when somebody acts like they think they're better than you, or where you can tell they think you're better than you? Chances are that's not a person you want as your coach or mentor. How do you feel when you don't have a choice and you're told what to do, or you don't have a voice? And conversely, how do you feel when it's a back and forth flow of conversation where you're excited about talking about something with somebody who's keen with you? And that dialogue usually involves a chance to think, and teachers want to be involved in the thinking. Simple example of that is the idea of curriculum development. If you spend the summer eating unhealthy food and developing a new curriculum, and you're going to teach it in the fall, when the fall rolls around, you're kind of excited about teaching it. No kid has ever had an algebra class like the one you're going to teach. But if you're not on the committee and you're given this thing to do that was created by that committee, it's just one more thing you had to do. Because you weren't a part of the thinking, you don't embrace it. But if we're involved in the thinking and things that matter, which is the idea of praxis, real life application, and it's reciprocal, chances are people who experience that kind of partnership will blow you away. To fail to take the partnership approach, I think, puts us at risk for not taking advantage of the brains in our teachers. And when we take the partnership approach, we say these are people who should be heard, who have a lot to contribute, and who, when they work together, can really do amazing things. In my experience, when you put teachers together and they feel respected and they have choice in structured and meaningful activities, they will blow you away. The flip side is also true. You don't give people a choice, and you tell them what to do, and you don't allow them to do any thinking with the process, and you take a whole top-down approach. Kind of the best you can hope for is a kind of mediocre compliance, and that's at the best. So that's the principles, and a little background on where they came from, a little bit about the research. I started out with these questions. Where did they come from? What was the research? What is a principle? A principle is a behavior that guides you. What are responsible and responsive accountability? Responsible involves a choice, because without a choice, people don't feel responsible. They just do what they're told. And what's a culture of talk and a culture of action? Well, a culture of talk is a culture grounded in praxis. Now, if you're looking for a place to find more about this, I've given you many resources online, but my book that summarizes this is Unmistakable Impact. And if you want to read more, you can go there, but there's a lot of free resources that I've linked up here too. Thanks for listening. I'm going to hand it back to my colleagues from Corwin, Stephanie and Jackie, and I'll turn it back to you guys. Thanks for setting this up.
Thanks, Jim. Just wanted to send out another call for questions from folks. Right now, the only question I really got from folks was just some clarification around the follow-up institute related to this webinar. And I'm just going to give my pitch anyway, so bear with me as I read a little bit more of the description. It's the High Impact Professional Learning Institute, and it's designed to showcase the high leverage practices that achieve dramatic student outcomes, foster alignment between purpose and action for educators at all levels of the school system, and develop school cultures focused on remarkable results. As mentioned, it'll be on June 11th, and Corwin and the University of Phoenix will be partnering to bring Jim Knight and Ann Hoffman to you in Phoenix, Arizona. And the great thing about this institute is the University of Phoenix is actually going to be subsidizing part of the registration for, some of the tickets for a limited time. So really take advantage of that. They're covering $100 for some of the tickets, and it's really a very generous offer on their part. So really encourage folks to take advantage of that. The other logistical question that I'm getting now is whether this webinar will be available as an archive, and we will be sending that out. You'll be receiving an email from us about this webinar.
I'll post it on all the usual places too, Stephanie. So I'll put a tweet out and put it on our Facebook page and share it that way. You know, in the high impact instruction Professional Learning Institute, we're kind of doing sort of a quick overview of many things, but the main focus in the first thing is how we relate with people, a lot of the ideas from the book Better Conversation, and the second part is on instruction, and that's really going to focus on high-impact instruction. And we'll ground that in different models for change, like coaching and the impact school model, but kind of a quick overview of everything, so it should be a lot of fun.
Great. So I'm going to pause for a couple of minutes, give some folks some time to type up their questions if they have any other questions. And otherwise, it looks like we've got everything covered. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in. Thank you again to all of you who took the time out to attend this webinar, to our presenter, Jim Knight, and our sponsors, Corwin and the University of Phoenix. Oh, actually, there is a question. How do you build an urgency for self-reflection, Jim?
Well, that question is kind of a non-partnership question, because if we're trying to build urgency in other people, what we're saying is, I know what that other person needs, and they should do, and I don't mean to go right to being negative here, but the first thing would be, I think, in terms of an urgency for improvement, is to have a process where people get clear picture of current reality, and they have an opportunity to set goals that matter to them and that matter to their students. In our coaching model, and go on radicallearners.com and you go back about 10 columns, there's one that says recent articles on coaching, and you can download this one that the Journal of Staff Development published on the coaching cycle. But anyway, our model is a way of doing that. But an urgency for self-reflection has to grow, I think, out of a person's choosing to do it. If we're trying to get them to do something, it's not going to happen. And I would just say, you can say in schools that professional learning is a non-negotiable. Everybody has to be engaged in improving. But when we start to tell people how they're supposed to do it, I think that's where it becomes a problem, because, often people will say to me, should coaching be voluntary, or should it be everybody do it, compulsory? And my answer to that is, it is voluntary, whether you call it that or not. I mean, you might get people to comply and do the bare minimum if you tell them they have to do it, but that's the best you're going to get. So when you take the compulsory approach to things and don't give people choices, what happens is you get a low level of commitment. So a better process, I think, is to give people a process, and that's the coaching cycle. That would be the second part if we had all day here. But give them a process that leads to measurable change. For us, that involves getting a clear picture of your class by looking at a video, working through with a coach a set of questions to lead to a goal that matters to the teacher, that focuses on the thing that's keeping them awake as they drive home at night, the thing they're worried about, and then having a process where it's really easy for them to learn the new tool and try it out, measure progress to the goal, and sticking with it until you hit the goal. So that's kind of how the whole thing works. I know traditionally, and that's kind of in the DC and Ryan comment there earlier in the session, traditionally we think that they have to do it because I tell them, but I think that very belief that we have to get people to do something without giving them a choice and a voice in this day is why we find ourselves in the situation we're in. We really need to give people more choice, not less. So there's a long answer to a short question.
We've got a few more coming in now. And this kind of is related. How do you handle situations where you're coming from a place of trying to build a partnership but meet resistance?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I'd want to reflect on what the concept of resistance really means. In a book called Motivational Interviewing by Miller and Rolnick, they say the word resistance isn't really a good one. A better way to put it is to say that there's a misalignment. Because resistance means I've got something I want you to do and you're not doing it. And that's not a partnership approach. The partnership approach is, how can I help you achieve your goals? And so I think the first question would be, why am I encountering resistance? Now, I wrote a whole article on resistance for CAPN. It's called Understanding Teacher Resistance from a few years ago, so you could Google it. Resistance usually comes down to two things. People don't do something either because they don't think it's worth it or they don't think they can do it. But if they think it's worth it and they can do it, they're going to be all in. But if they don't have a choice about it, they're not going to even get to the point of thinking it's worth it. So part of reducing resistance is to take the partnership approach, which is to talk to the person as an equal, a person who can make choices and say, well, here's our situation, how would you like to do it? And if they say, I don't want to work with you, then let it happen. I mean, if they say, I don't want to improve the teacher, that's an administrative issue. But in terms of working with a coach, for example, if the person says, I really don't want to do it, in my opinion, I don't think a teacher talking to a teacher has the right to say, oh, you need to do it. I think a teacher just says, that's your choice and good, you know. So that's how I'd see it.
Thanks for that, Jim. Clark was asking, are there any other resources available to guide administrators in providing structure with choice?
I think for school-wide change, not that I want to sell the book and everything, although I did put it in the slide, but nonetheless, I think the place to go is the Unmistakable Impact, the book. And it lays out the process. I just did a webinar for Australia about success factors for coaching, but you could quickly apply those success factors to pretty much any change initiative. And I'll put that's on our Facebook page, which is just facebook.com/instructional.coaching. But I'll also put a bunch of blogs together in a couple days on the Radical Learners blog, so radicallearners.com. So if you go there, and I think maybe that webinar for the Australia schools on success factors for coaching programs could apply back to any change initiative. And it's about 40 minutes long.
And so I think everybody's really hungry for some resources, but Lindsay is also asking, out of all the books you referenced today, which one would you recommend starting with first? And maybe she's already read Unmistakable Impact, but she said other than Unmistakable Impact.
Well, probably off the top of my head, I mean, Boehm's book on dialogue is a very short and powerful book. Peter Block's book, Stewardship, is a pretty good survey. It's a really outstanding book, but also it's not a real challenge to go through. I would probably go there. I mean, if you're really interested in a feminist perspective on partnership, you might look at Rian Eisler's book. If you're really interested in student voice, then Russ Qualia's book on student voice would be the logical one to look at. So I guess it kind of depends on what your interest is. And Daniel Pink's book, Drive, is a really, really good introduction to the whole importance of autonomy. If your focus is on change, Michael Fullen's 6 Secrets of Change. Helping by Edgar Schein is a great book. Schein's book might be a good starting point. Helping, he kind of lays things out about the importance of status in relationships. So I think any of those would be a really good start. If I have to pick just one, though, I think maybe I would pick Helping by Edgar Schein.
And just so that we can stay on time, this will be our last question. How do you build partnership between coach and the teacher approach when it's being required by a principal?
Well, that's going to make it tougher. You know, inherently, often people, if they're told what to do, it's going to be tougher. I think one thing I want to do is go back to the principal and suggest that improvement is non-negotiable. Everybody has to be engaged in some process. And so in Focus on Teaching, my book on video, there's a process teachers can use to improve their skills on their own. They still have to set a really clear goal. They have to improve. I think that should be built into people's contracts, an expectation of continuous improvement. We won't get the schools we want unless teachers aren't learners. But to say you have to have a coach, it makes it more difficult. And so the first thing I'd say is let's go back to that fundamental assumption and rethink it and say, well, maybe we shouldn't make it compulsory. But let's say you don't have a choice. You can't control that. It is the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be. And you're a coach, and the teachers are told they have to work with you. Then I would say you still say, well, how would I want to be treated if somebody was helping me? I would want them to value my expertise. I would want them to give me some choices within the lack of choice. I would want them to help me set a goal that matters to me. You want to make sure that what you do is going to give teachers something that makes a big difference, that's worth it, and you want to make it easy for them to do it. And so if you go back to that coaching cycle on the Radical Learners blog, like I said, it's about 10 columns in, and it's just called the coaching cycle. It's a little column on recent articles about coaching. It lays out the process, but inherent in the process is a real respect for the knowledge of the other person, a real respect for them as a human being who should be heard and listened to and have a choice. And even if it's a compulsory thing, you can still say to them, here are the choices, here's the situation. And there needs to be a real honesty and transparency about the relationship. I think that's a part of it too. So whatever the situation is, I guess you can always treat the other person with a lot of respect. You can still put them in the big chair, and you can sit in the little chair. You can still see coaching as an act of service, even though what you're doing is in a structure doesn't look like that, a compulsory structure. It's just harder.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks again to everyone for taking the time out, and just thank you to everyone. We will be sending the recording out to the folks on the call. If you know anybody who might have missed the webinar, we'll also be sending the recording out to them. Feel free to forward it to anybody else who might be interested. We do want to share the content out. It is valuable information. So thanks again for joining us. Have a wonderful evening or afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks, Stephanie. It was fun.